Welcome to Midnight Whispers today. We're venturing deep into the heart of 10 real cabin-in-the-woods horror stories for a sleepless night, where the land is as vast as its legends, and just as terrifying. From eerie lights haunting dark rivers to ancient forces that never should have been disturbed, get ready for some of the most disturbing true horror stories that will make you question what's real and what's lurking just beyond the horizon. Picture a cabin shrouded in fog, hidden miles from the nearest road. The trees around it seem to lean closer when you pass, whispering in a language only the wind understands. Night falls, and with it comes silence so thick it presses against your chest, broken only by distant snaps of twigs or the faint creak of the cabin floor above. Sometimes shadows move on their own, stretching and curling where no light should reach. Travelers speak of voices, soft, urgent, and familiar, calling from the forest, urging them closer, or warning them away. Tonight we'll step into these remote corners of the world, where isolation sharpens fear and ordinary moments twist into nightmares. Every story begins like a quiet evening, but each ends with a question you won't want to answer. If a place or a voice like this has ever followed you home, tell us below. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. If these investigations mean something to you, please subscribe. It's just one click, but it keeps the lights on while we keep listening in the dark. And now, let's step inside Chapter 1. Story 1. The Cabin at Pine Hollow. I remember the trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened almost 6 years ago. It was mid-October, around 4:30 p.m., and the sun was already dipping behind the thick pine forests of northern Maine. The air was damp, smelling of wet leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys, and the early frost had begun to make the gravel road slick under our tires. My friends and I had rented a small cabin tucked deep into Pine Hollow, a place none of us had visited before. The owner had warned us about the isolation, but we were eager for a weekend away from the city. No internet, no cell service, just the kind of quiet you only get when the world feels like it's forgotten you. The cabin itself was modest, a single floor, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. Everything felt warm at first, comforting even, like stepping into a memory that wasn't yours. But as night settled, a sense of unease began creeping in. Small things at first, the floorboards creaking at odd times even though we were all in the living room, or the way the wind sounded when it pushed through the trees, like distant whispers. I shrugged it off as the cabin settling and told myself that the isolation was just getting under my skin. Around 11:30 p.m., we were sitting in the living room, drinking coffee and joking about ghost stories, when I noticed it, the first subtle but undeniable sound that made my stomach drop. A knock, very soft, came from the back door. Not a bang, not the wind. It was deliberate. I looked at my friends and we all froze for a moment before laughing nervously. "Probably a raccoon," one of them said, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes. I got up, opened the door, and there was nothing. Just the darkness of the forest, the trees swaying in the October wind. That should have been the end of it, but the knock came again about 10 minutes later, this time louder and more insistent. My friends wanted to call it a night, but I had this irrational curiosity. I needed to know if someone was really out there. I went around the back, shining my phone light into the woods, but the trees were empty, and the gravel path showed no footprints. The wind was still, unnervingly so, and that silence was heavier than the darkness. I felt eyes on me, though I knew it was impossible. No one could have been close enough to watch me without me seeing them. I closed the door and tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Something about that moment was wrong. Like the air itself had changed. The rest of the night blurred into a series of unsettling events I still can't explain. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. Though I was certain I had locked it, I froze under the blanket, listening as footsteps moved across the living room floor, slow and deliberate. I whispered to my friends, shaking them awake, but no one else had heard it. We stayed in one room, flashlight beams trembling in our hands until the sun started to rise, casting long shadows through the cabin windows. By morning, everything seemed normal again. The door was closed, the forest quiet, nothing out of place. We packed up and left that morning, laughing to convince ourselves it was all in our heads, yet every few weeks I find myself thinking about those footsteps, the knocks, the eyes that weren't there. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear soft knocking on my apartment window. Even though I live on the 3rd floor in the middle of the city, I've never gone back to Pine Hollow and I never will. but I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home, and that one day it might finally decide to make itself known. Story 2. The Stranger on Lakeview Road. It was late September, around 8:45 p.m., and the sky had that deep indigo hue right before the stars fully appear, the kind that makes the edges of the woods seem sharper, more angular. I was driving back from my night shift at the diner in Cedar Falls, a sleepy town in upstate New York, and the streets were unusually empty, with only the occasional hum of a passing car. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and the crisp early fall leaves, and there was a thin mist rising off the nearby lake that made the headlights of my old Honda seem weak and fragile. I had taken Lakeview Road 100 times before. It's a narrow, winding stretch that cuts through dense pine and oak, with the occasional abandoned cabin tucked far back from the road. That night, though, something felt off. About halfway down the road, I noticed a figure standing by the edge of the forest just past a bend. At first, I thought it might be a hiker or someone waiting for a ride, but even from 50 feet away, it didn't make sense. The way he stood, completely still, facing the road, shoulders tense, hands at his sides, it was unnatural. I slowed, rolling down my window despite the chill, and called out, "Hey, you okay?" But he didn't move, didn't flinch. My stomach tightened, the kind of unease that makes you immediately aware of how vulnerable you are. I tried to convince myself it was just someone playing a prank, a friend maybe. But the more I looked, the more I realized he wasn't waving, smiling, or reacting at all, just watching. I passed him slowly, my headlights cutting into the mist, and when I glanced in the rearview mirror, he was gone, or so I thought. About 2 miles down the road, as the trees thickened and the fog crept closer to the asphalt, I noticed something in my peripheral vision, a shadow moving fast, keeping pace with the car even though I hadn't stopped. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the fog, maybe an animal, but the shape was distinctly human, thin and unnaturally long-limbed, almost gliding rather than running. My pulse spiked and I reached for my phone only to find there was no signal. Of course, no signal. Panic was settling in as I drove faster, trying to convince myself to turn onto a side road anywhere to get out of the woods. Then, headlights appeared behind me, bright and sudden, and I thought maybe someone else was coming along to help. Relief hit me briefly, but as the car drew closer, I realized it wasn't another driver. It was the stranger from earlier. No movement in the road, just the headlights reflecting off his face. I slammed on the brakes, heart hammering, but there was nothing there when I looked up. No one. Just the empty road and the mist curling between the trees. I pulled over, trying to breathe, gripping the wheel and listening. Only the faint hum of my engine and the distant calls of birds that shouldn't be awake at this hour. I sat there for what felt like hours, though it was probably 20 minutes, waiting for my rational mind to reassert itself. Eventually, I forced myself to drive again, keeping the brights on the whole way, scanning the tree line. When I finally reached the main road, the mist disappeared, and my radio, which had been dead for miles, suddenly came back with static-laced music. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was a trick of exhaustion. Maybe the result of working a 12-hour shift. Maybe some local legend my subconscious had remembered about the Watcher of Lakeview Road. But the strangest part came a week later. I was telling a friend about it at a diner, trying to downplay it, when she frowned and said, "Lakeview Road? There's been a few disappearances out there. They say if you drive late at night, you might see someone watching from the trees. People who see them? They're never the same." I laughed again a little too loudly and left it at that. But I still think about it sometimes, especially on misty nights when the air smells like wet leaves and asphalt. And sometimes when I'm walking alone at night near my apartment, I swear I see a figure standing just beyond the streetlight, completely still, watching, waiting. I've never gone back to Lakeview Road, and I never will. And yet, there's a part of me that wonders if he's still there, and if one day I might see him again and he won't be standing at the edge of the road, but closer, inside my life. Story 3. The Cabin Behind Hollow Creek. It was the second weekend of November, a Saturday night that had already brought a chill sharp enough to make the exposed skin on my hands sting as I drove. I had rented a small cabin behind Hollow Creek, a few miles outside of Brattleboro, Vermont. The GPS signal cut out completely once I turned off Route 9, leaving only the dim glow of my dashboard to guide me along the winding dirt path flanked by dense forest. The wind whipped the bare branches against my windshield like skeletal fingers, and the first snow of the season had begun to fall in light, wet flakes that made the road slick. I arrived around 6:20 p.m., the cabin's windows dark except for the faint reflection of my headlights, and unlocked the creaky front door, stepping into the warmth of the wood stove that had been left burning. At first, everything felt perfect, cozy even. The kind of quiet you imagine in magazines. The smell of pine and faint wood smoke and the soft, rhythmic tapping of the rain starting to mix with snow against the roof. But by 9 p.m., when I was unpacking and organizing firewood, I noticed a pattern in the woods beyond the clearing. The snow made no indentations except the ones I left. No animal tracks, no footprints of any kind. Even though the forest was alive with birds and squirrels during the day, I shrugged, attributing it to the depth of the snow. But as I carried a log to the fireplace, I felt it, the feeling of being watched. At first, I tried to laugh it off, but the more I listened, the more I became aware of the silence outside. The way it wasn't empty, but holding something, waiting. I could hear the wind in the trees, yes, but there was another sound too. Softer, intermittent, like someone pacing or someone breathing through the snow. Around 11:45 p.m., I was sitting in the living room drinking black coffee and scrolling through my phone to pass the time, when I noticed the shadow at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, thin and unmoving, blending with the dark trees but impossible to miss. I froze, half convinced I was seeing things, and whispered to myself, "It's just the shadows." I didn't move, didn't breathe, watching it. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then it was gone. Or maybe I had just blinked. I tried to rationalize it. A hunter, a neighbor, someone out walking their dog. But the problem was, I had checked with the cabin owner earlier that week, and he assured me the nearest house was almost half a mile down the dirt road, past the creek, and even they rarely came out this late. I tried to shake it off, pouring another cup of coffee, but the feeling of eyes on me lingered. Around 12:30 a.m., the snow suddenly stopped, the wind died, and an oppressive silence filled the forest. That's when I heard it. A single, deliberate knock on the cabin door, soft but heavy enough to echo in the small room. My heart stopped. I told myself it was probably a branch, maybe ice falling from the roof. But then it came again, 3 slow, measured knocks, as if someone was counting or testing me. My hands shook and I whispered, "Hello?" But no answer. I didn't move for a long time, staring at the door, waiting for some rational explanation, knowing deep down that there wasn't one. By 2:10 a.m., I couldn't sit there any longer. I grabbed a flashlight, convinced myself I needed to check the perimeter, though my rational mind screamed at me to stay inside. The snow crunched under my boots as I circled the cabin, but there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbances, just the trees and the dark, empty forest. I even checked behind the cabin, along the small trail that led to the creek, and still nothing. Yet when I turned back toward the door, I noticed the faint impression of a handprint in the condensation on the glass window. A handprint too large to be mine. The fingers long, strangely thin, and perfectly still. I wiped it away, heart hammering, telling myself it was condensation from the wood stove, a trick of the moisture, but I knew it wasn't. I packed my things in the car and drove back to Route 9 as quickly as I dared. The trees pressing in on both sides of the road, the snow beginning to fall again, soft and silent. It was only later, when I tried to laugh it off with friends, that the dread really settled in. The impression of that handprint stayed with me, and sometimes in the middle of the night I swear I feel it on my shoulder, or I catch a shadow moving at the edge of my vision. I haven't returned to Hollow Creek since that night, and I don't plan to, but every winter, when the first snow falls, I think about it, and I wonder if something or someone was waiting for me in the forest, waiting to follow me home unseen but always there, just beyond the edges of reality. Story 4. The hiker on Raven's Ridge. It was early October, around 5:15 p.m., when I parked my old Jeep at the trailhead for Raven's Ridge, a remote hiking area outside of Ashland, Oregon. The air was sharp and cool, carrying the faint scent of damp pine needles and the smoky tang of distant campfires, and the sky was a pale gray as the sun hovered low behind the mountain ridge. I had been hiking this trail dozens of times before, but this time I was alone, craving the kind of solitude that lets your mind quiet itself, or so I thought. The dirt trail was slick from an earlier rain, scattered with wet leaves that slipped under my boots as I moved. As I ascended, I noticed a faint set of footprints ahead of me. Boots, though slightly smaller than mine, and they didn't match any local ranger tracks I had seen before. I shrugged it off, assuming another hiker had passed through earlier in the day. But as I continued, the footprints seemed to appear and disappear randomly, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind. Around 6:20 p.m., with the sun nearly behind the ridge and shadows stretching long across the trail, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and lean, standing between the trees, just off the trail watching. I froze, my heart hammering, and whispered, "Hello?" The figure didn't move or respond. I waited, straining my eyes as the fading light trickled through the branches, but when I blinked, it was gone. That should have been enough for me to turn back, but something made me keep going. Curiosity or maybe foolish pride, though I didn't realize how dangerous that would be. By 7:05 p.m., the trail narrowed and the forest seemed to grow denser. Fog was rolling in from the ridge, thick enough that I could barely see the next step in front of me. I kept hearing small sounds, branches snapping, the occasional scuff of leaves, but every time I turned, no one was there. Then I heard it clearly, a voice, low and hushed, almost a whisper, saying my name. "Daniel." I froze, gripping my trekking poles tighter, my pulse spiking. I called out, "Who's there?" And the woods swallowed my words immediately. I remembered thinking rationally that it could be another hiker lost in the fog, but something in the tone of the voice didn't feel human, though I couldn't explain why. I quickened my pace, ears straining for any sign of someone following me. Then out of nowhere I felt a brush against my shoulder, light and deliberate, like a hand grazing me as I passed. I spun around, seeing nothing but the rolling mist and skeletal trees. I started talking aloud, telling myself I was overreacting, that it was fatigue or imagination. But the rational voice in my head was growing quieter as dread filled my chest. I could feel, rather than see, that someone or something was pacing me, keeping just outside my vision, always between me and the fading daylight. The sounds of my own breathing and footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, like the forest had narrowed itself around me. Closing in, 8:15 p.m., night had fallen completely, and I realized I had wandered far from the main trail. My flashlight barely penetrated the dense fog, illuminating only the immediate ground and the nearest tree trunks. Then I saw it, the figure just standing there again, closer than I thought possible, though every time I blinked it seemed to vanish. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I heard my name again, this time in multiple whispers, bouncing from tree to tree, echoing as if the forest itself were speaking. I stumbled, calling out for anyone, rationally begging for another human presence, but the forest remained silent except for the whispers. I finally reached a small clearing near a creek, hoping to find a familiar landmark, and caught sight of footprints in the mud, surrounding the area in a perfect circle. Too symmetrical, too deliberate. Panic overtook me and I ran blindly, following the creek downstream until I finally reached the trailhead parking lot around 9:10 p.m., my flashlight battery nearly dead. The Jeep was exactly where I left it, yet when I sat in the driver's seat shaking and covered in mud, I noticed the faintest smear of muddy handprints on the hood, small, too precise and wet as if someone had just touched it. I never saw anyone, never heard any movement again, but I knew that someone, or something, had followed me, pacing my steps through the fog. Even now, years later, when I hike other trails alone, I catch fleeting glimpses of a shadow at the edge of my vision, or feel a brush on my shoulder, and I swear sometimes I hear someone whisper my name from the trees. I haven't returned to Raven's Ridge, and I don't intend to, yet the memory never leaves me, and I know that whatever watched me that night is still there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to walk alone after dark. Story 5. The cabin on Black Hollow Road. It was mid-December, around 6:40 p.m., when I turned off State Route 112 onto Black Hollow Road, a narrow, snow-dusted lane lined with pine trees whose branches hung heavy with frost. The sky was already darkening, a gray so deep it almost felt like velvet pressing down on the world, and the wind carried a sharp bite that made my cheeks sting. I had rented a small cabin on the far end of the road, a place I found on a local listing site that promised peace and quiet for winter getaways, and after a long drive from Boston, I was eager to get inside. The cabin itself was modest. One bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in a few years. The door creaked as I unlocked it, and a chill ran down my spine. Not from the cold, but from the overwhelming silence that hit me as soon as I stepped inside. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just isolation, nothing more, and started unpacking my things. Around 7:15 p.m., I made myself a cup of tea and settled in front of the fireplace, listening to the faint hiss of the wind against the cabin walls. That's when I first noticed it. Soft tapping against the window by the kitchen sink, rhythmic and deliberate. I froze, straining my ears, and whispered, "Hello?" But there was no answer. I told myself it was the wind, perhaps a branch brushing against the glass. Yet the pattern of the tapping continued, too regular to be natural, almost as if someone or something was testing me. By 9:05 p.m., the tapping had grown louder, shifting from the kitchen window to the front of the cabin, accompanied now by faint scraping sounds along the siding. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the snow crunching under my boots, sweeping the beam across the trees and driveway. But there was nothing. No footprints, no shadows, no signs of anyone at all. I called out, voice trembling, "Is someone there?" The silence was immediate, suffocating, broken only by the gusts of wind that rustled the pine needles. I went back inside, trying to convince myself it was exhaustion or nerves playing tricks on me, but the uneasy feeling stuck, crawling along my spine and refusing to leave. At 11:30 p.m., I attempted to go to bed, locking the door behind me and double-checking the windows, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around 12:10 a.m., I woke to a low thump in the living room, followed by the faintest sound of footsteps across the floorboards. I sat frozen under the blanket, listening as the footsteps circled the room, deliberate, slow, and careful, though no one had entered and I was alone. Or so I thought. I whispered the names of family and friends aloud, almost pleading, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But the footsteps continued, pacing me, never pausing, always just beyond my line of sight. My pulse thumped in my ears, louder than any sound the cabin made, yet I couldn't move, too paralyzed by fear and confusion to even reach for the flashlight on the nightstand. By 2:05 a.m., I knew I couldn't stay in the bedroom any longer. I crept toward the living room, gripping the edge of the blanket around my shoulders like armor. The fireplace flickered, casting shadows along the walls, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw a figure standing near the door. Tall, thin, and impossibly still, almost blending into the darkness. My first instinct was to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I slowly turned the flashlight on, sweeping it across the room, but the figure vanished, leaving only the empty space where it had been. That's when I noticed the prints on the wooden floor, barefoot, small, and damp, leading from the front door to the living room, though I hadn't left it open. I checked the door again. It was locked, as were all the windows. I left the cabin at sunrise, driving without looking back, snow crunching under the tires, the cold air stinging my face as if to warn me that whatever followed me into the night would not be gone. Even now, months later, I still feel it sometimes, when I sit alone in my apartment. Working late, I hear faint scratches along the walls, soft taps on the windows, or the unmistakable sound of someone pacing just beyond the edge of the room. I don't know if it was human, something else, or just my imagination, but Black Hollow Road and that cabin are etched into my memory, a place I will never return to, and a presence I feel may still be watching, waiting, silent but patient. Story 6. The Cabin by Whispering Pines. It was early November, around 5:50 p.m., when I drove down the narrow gravel road leading to the cabin I had rented near Whispering Pines, a secluded forest area outside of Portland, Maine. The sky was a dull cloud-covered gray, and the wind pushed through the tall pine trees in a way that made them groan and sway, almost like the forest itself was alive. The first hint that something wasn't quite right came when I parked my car in the small clearing by the cabin and noticed the smell. Something acrid, faint, almost like burned wood mixed with damp earth, lingering in the cold air. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and surprisingly well-maintained, with a stone chimney, wooden siding, and 2 small windows that reflected the dimming light. I unloaded my bags around 6:10 p.m., noting that the forest beyond the clearing was unnaturally still, the usual chatter of birds and squirrels replaced by silence so thick it pressed against my ears. As I stepped inside, I could hear the faint hum of the heating system, but otherwise the cabin was quiet. I unpacked slowly, setting up a small lamp in the corner of the living room, and tried to convince myself that the unease I felt was just fatigue from the long drive. Around 7:20 p.m., I noticed a shadow at the edge of the clearing outside the window. A figure that was too dark, too rigid to be a tree, standing perfectly still as if it had been waiting for me. I froze, gripping my cup of coffee, and whispered, "Hello?" The shadow didn't move, didn't react. I blinked, and it was gone. Or at least, I told myself it was gone. But my chest was tight with a creeping panic I couldn't shake. By 9 p.m., the wind had grown colder, pushing through gaps in the window frames despite my attempts to seal them. And the forest outside seemed to shift in the darkness, the trees creating shapes and movements my rational mind didn't want to acknowledge. I was sitting in the living room trying to read on my tablet when I heard it. A soft knock at the front door. Slow, deliberate, measured. I jumped, almost spilling my coffee, and whispered, "Hello?" No answer. I checked the locks. Everything was secure. I convinced myself it was just a branch, a trick of the wind. But the knocking continued, now accompanied by the faintest scraping sound along the siding of the cabin, almost like fingernails running lightly over wood. My pulse spiked, and I grabbed my flashlight, stepping onto the small porch and sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing. Just trees swaying in the wind, snow beginning to fall in small wet flakes, and silence that seemed to press closer. I went back inside, locked the door again, and tried to settle on the couch, but I couldn't stop hearing it. The scraping, faint footsteps across the floorboards that weren't there. Soft whispers at the edge of my hearing that seemed to carry through the walls themselves. I told myself it was the isolation, the late hour, maybe even some leftover adrenaline from the drive, but deep down, I knew it wasn't imagination. Something was out there, and it was aware of me. By 12:30 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat, keys, and flashlight and stepped into the snow-covered clearing, intending to walk to the nearest main road, a mile down the gravel track. The snow crunched under my boots, each step echoing unnaturally in the stillness, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling the weight of invisible eyes pressing down on me. Then I heard it, the whisper, clear and deliberate this time, calling my name from just beyond the tree line. "Daniel." My heart stopped. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the dark, illuminating only the snow and the shifting silhouettes of pine trees. No one. I ran, breath ripping from my lungs, the whispering continuing behind me, mingling with the sound of my own rapid steps. I reached my car, breathless, and got in, starting the engine without looking back, the headlights catching a fleeting glimpse of a dark figure standing at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still, watching. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, and even now, weeks later, I still hear whispers when I'm alone at night. Faint, almost imperceptible, calling my name. I've never returned to Whispering Pines, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, when the wind is right and the shadows fall a certain way across my living room, I swear I see the outline of that figure at the edge of my vision, waiting, patient, and very much still out there. Story 7, the cabin at Hollow Creek Falls. It was late October, around 6:05 p.m. when I arrived at the small cabin I had rented near Hollow Creek Falls, a remote area just outside of Montpelier, Vermont. The sky was heavy with clouds, a slate gray that promised rain, and the air was damp, carrying the faint smell of wet leaves and pine. The road to the cabin was narrow and winding, flanked by dense trees whose branches brushed the sides of my car as I drove slowly. The cabin itself was modest, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace, but there was something oddly out of place about it. The way the shadows seemed to cling to the corners even in the dim glow of the interior lights. I unloaded my bags around 6:30 p.m., noting that the forest beyond the clearing was unnaturally still. No birds, no squirrels, not even the usual rustle of leaves in the wind. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just isolation, maybe the time of day, and started unpacking. By 7:15 p.m., I had made tea and settled in the living room, trying to focus on a book, but a low feeling of unease kept creeping in, pressing against my chest in a way I couldn't ignore. That's when I first noticed it, faint tapping at the window facing the forest. At first I thought it was a branch, but the rhythm was too steady, deliberate. I whispered, "Hello?" and the forest swallowed my words. The tapping stopped immediately, and the silence that followed was so thick it felt like it was pressing down on me. I told myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. Yet I couldn't shake the sense of being watched from just beyond the glass. By 9:10 p.m., the unease had grown unbearable. The tapping returned, this time accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. Though I was certain I had locked every door, I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking, and stepped onto the porch, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The snowless ground revealed no footprints, no disturbance of any kind, just the dark forest. "Hello?" I called again, my voice cracking, and the only reply was the whisper of wind through the trees. I returned inside, trying to rationalize it as the imagination running wild. But then the sound shifted, faint scratching along the siding of the cabin, low and deliberate, as if someone or something was moving along the wall, testing it. I froze, listening, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, soft but unmistakable, I heard a voice from the living room, a low murmur repeating my name, "Daniel." It wasn't angry, it wasn't urgent, but it carried weight, and it felt close, impossibly close, yet there was no one there. I grabbed the keys to my car and debated leaving immediately, but the rain had started, and the gravel road leading out had already begun to form slick patches. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that the combination of isolation, fatigue, and the weather was conjuring things that weren't real. Yet every instinct screamed that I wasn't imagining this. Something was there just beyond my vision, watching. By 12:45 a.m., the fear became unbearable. I forced myself to move through the cabin, flashlight in hand, checking each room, even opening closets and cabinets, yet every room was empty. Then I saw it. The faint impression of a hand on the fogged-over kitchen window, small and damp, with fingers unnaturally long. I knew I had locked the doors, checked the windows, and yet there it was, as if someone had been inside, brushing against the glass while I wasn't looking. My mind raced with questions I had no answers to. I left the cabin at dawn, driving without looking back, the forest still thick and oppressive around the gravel road. Weeks later, I still wake in the middle of the night to soft scratches along my apartment walls or faint tapping at my windows that vanishes when I turn the light on. I haven't returned to Hollow Creek Falls, and I don't intend to, yet the memory lingers, persistent and suffocating, a shadow that follows me in quiet moments. Something or someone was in that cabin with me, and I have no idea if it ever truly left. The thought that it might still be out there, patient, watching, waiting for another traveler, haunts me every time I hear the wind rustling through the trees. Story 8. The cabin on Mistwood Trail. It was a cold, rainy November evening around 6:15 p.m. when I drove the winding road up to the cabin I had rented on Mistwood Trail just outside of Barr, Vermont. The sky was heavy with thick, low-hanging clouds, and the rain drizzled steadily, soaking the mossy trees that lined the narrow gravel path. The headlights of my old Subaru barely pierced the gloom, reflecting off the wet leaves that clung to the road. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, its windows dark and unwelcoming. I remember stepping out of the car and feeling the chill seep through my jacket, carrying the faint, earthy smell of wet pine needles and decaying leaves. The air was eerily still except for the occasional drip of water from the roof. I unlocked the door at 6:40 p.m., stepping inside to the musty scent of old wood and cold air that hadn't been warmed for weeks. I lit the fireplace and set my bags down. The only sounds in the cabin, the soft crackling of the fire and the rain hitting the roof. At first I felt comforted, but as the night deepened, I began to notice things that didn't make sense, subtle sounds, almost imperceptible, like soft scuffing on the floor above, though the cabin only had one level, or faint whispers that seemed to come from just outside the windows carried on the wind. I tried to rationalize it, the wind, my imagination, the creaks of an old building settling. But the unease lingered, a low, gnawing sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the dense forest surrounding the cabin. By 8:50 p.m., the rain had intensified, and the forest outside seemed to darken even more under the sheets of water, the trees twisting into shapes my mind didn't want to acknowledge. I was sitting in the living room nursing a cup of tea when I noticed a shadow flicker across one of the windows facing the woods. My first thought was an animal, but there was no rustling, no movement in the leaves. I whispered, "Hello?" hoping for an answer that never came. The shadow was gone, yet the sense of being watched remained. Around 10:15 p.m., I began hearing tapping, soft, deliberate, on the roof above me, almost like footsteps pacing the attic, though there was none. My pulse quickened and I called out again, "Is someone there?" But the only response was the hollow echo of my own voice. I checked the windows. All were locked. I stepped outside for a moment, flashlight in hand, sweeping the perimeter. But the forest revealed nothing. No footprints, no animals, no signs of life. The silence returned, deeper than before, oppressive, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I went back inside, trying to laugh it off, telling myself I was alone and that fear was twisting reality. But the low whispering started again, just at the edge of hearing, almost unintelligible, repeating fragments of words I couldn't make out. The rational part of me told myself to leave, yet some irrational curiosity kept me rooted, and the fear only grew heavier. By 12:45 a.m., I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I packed a bag and prepared to leave, but when I opened the front door, the rain had stopped, and the forest was unnaturally quiet, too quiet, as if it were waiting. I walked toward my car, the gravel crunching under my boots, and that's when I heard it. A soft scraping from behind, slow, deliberate, following my steps. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating only the dense, wet trees. No one. I ran the rest of the way to the car, hands shaking, breath coming in short gasps, and drove off the trail without looking back. Weeks later, I still feel it, faint tapping at my windows when I'm home alone, whispers at the edge of hearing that vanish when I strain to listen, and shadows that appear just outside the corner of my vision. I haven't returned to Mistwood Trail, and I don't intend to, yet the memory clings to me, persistent and chilling. I know without a doubt that something watched me that night, patient and silent, and I cannot shake the feeling that it is still waiting there for the next traveler foolish enough to enter its woods. Story 9. The cabin at Shadow Creek. It was mid-October, around 6:25 p.m. when I pulled off the narrow gravel road leading to the cabin I had rented near Shadow Creek, just outside of Stowe, Vermont. The sky was heavy with clouds, and a light drizzle fell, slicking the road and coating the pine trees in moisture. The air was cold, damp, and smelled faintly of wet earth and fallen leaves. The cabin itself was small and isolated, perched on the edge of a clearing with dense forest rising behind it. Its dark wooden siding and dim windows gave it an almost lifeless appearance, and the longer I stared at it, the more the isolation pressed on me. I stepped out of my car at 6:40 p.m., the gravel crunching under my boots, and felt the first prickle of unease creep over me. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and faint mildew. I unpacked slowly, trying to focus on lighting the fireplace and making the space feel welcoming. But every time I glanced out the windows, I could swear I saw shapes moving in the trees, just beyond the range of the dim light filtering from inside. At first I dismissed it, attributing the shapes to the wind, shadows, or my imagination. By 7:15 p.m., however, the unease had grown, pressing against my chest like a weight. The sound of soft, rhythmic tapping at the window caught my attention. I froze, whispering, "Hello?" The only answer was the muted patter of rain, yet the tapping persisted in irregular intervals, deliberate enough to make my stomach tighten with fear. The longer I sat there, the more aware I became of the silence outside, how it was almost unnatural, as though the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting. By 9:05 p.m., the tapping had shifted from the windows to the roof, a slow, deliberate rhythm that made every hair on my arm stand on end. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was the old cabin settling or branches scraping against the shingles in the wind, but the sound didn't match the wind or the weather. I whispered aloud, "Is someone there?" My voice felt ridiculously loud, echoing in the confined space, yet no answer came. I gripped a flashlight and stepped outside, sweeping the beam across the clearing and the edges of the surrounding forest, but there was nothing. No footprints, no shadows, no movement. The rain continued, dripping from the roof and soaking the gravel, but the forest remained unnervingly still except for the occasional snap of a branch that sounded too close, too deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, that the isolation had my nerves on edge, but then I heard it, a faint whisper, almost too soft to hear, calling my name. "Michael." The voice was low, deliberate, and somehow familiar. Yet I knew it couldn't be anyone I knew. My pulse spiked, my breath caught, and I instinctively stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. I sat on the couch, heart hammering, telling myself rational explanations. Yet the whispers persisted, faint but continuous, coming from somewhere between the walls and the trees. Impossible to place, impossible to ignore. My body felt frozen, and I could hear my own heartbeat thundering as I realized how isolated I truly was. By 12:55 a.m., I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer, but stepping outside felt unbearable. I gathered my keys and flashlight, my mind racing with dread, and cautiously made my way to the car, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest silent in a way that was almost worse, as though it were holding its breath, waiting. That's when I saw it, a dark humanoid shape standing at the edge of the clearing, motionless, watching me. I froze, unable to take another step, as the shadow remained perfectly still despite the fading mist. I ducked into my car and started the engine, headlights cutting across the clearing, and when I looked again, the shape was gone, leaving only the empty forest and the echo of my panicked breaths. I drove without stopping until I reached the main road, but even now, months later, I still feel it. Sometimes, in quiet moments at home, I hear soft tapping at the windows, or a faint whisper at the edge of hearing that disappears when I strain to listen. I haven't returned to Shadow Creek, and I never will. Yet the memory lingers, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was there that night is still waiting, patient and silent just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting for the next person, foolish enough to venture into its domain. Story 10. The cabin in Blackwood Hollow. It was late September, around 5:50 p.m. when I turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin I had rented in Blackwood Hollow, a secluded area just outside Keene, New Hampshire. The sky was overcast, the clouds hanging low and heavy, and a damp fog had begun to creep along the treetops, curling around the thick pines like fingers. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no squirrels, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. The cabin appeared after a long curve in the road, a dark silhouette among the trees, its windows reflecting the dim gray light. I parked my car at the edge of the clearing at 6:10 p.m., the gravel crunching under my boots, and felt a twinge of unease as I looked around. The isolation pressed against me like a physical weight. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of smoke and damp wood. I unpacked my bags and lit the fireplace, the warmth contrasting with the cold, damp air outside. Around 6:40 p.m., I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock on the front door. My first thought was a neighbor or a lost hiker, but the nearest house was over a mile away and I had told no one of my trip. I called out, "Hello?" but there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. When I opened the door, nothing but fog and forest greeted me. I tried to rationalize it, branches, animals, exhaustion, but a deep, gnawing unease had already begun to take hold. By 8:05 p.m., the wind had picked up, making the trees sway and creak in ways that sounded almost human. I was sitting in the living room trying to focus on a book, but the rhythmic tapping had returned, this time from the kitchen window. It was slow, deliberate, almost as if someone were testing my nerves. I whispered, "Is someone there?" My own voice seemed too loud in the stillness, echoing against the wooden walls, and no answer came. The tapping shifted to the roof above, accompanied now by faint scuffing sounds along the floorboards, though the cabin only had one level. I felt my pulse spike and the hair on my arms stand on end. At 9:30 p.m., I stepped outside with a flashlight, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The fog was thick, but I could see nothing. No footprints, no movement, nothing to explain the sounds. Yet the feeling of being watched pressed on me, heavier with each passing second. Returning inside, I sat rigidly on the couch, listening. The scuffing and tapping continued, interspersed with faint whispers that seemed to come from the forest beyond the cabin, repeating words I couldn't quite understand. My rational mind told me to leave, to drive down the gravel road and never look back. But something kept me frozen in place like a moth caught in the glare of a light. By 12:35 a.m., I could no longer ignore the sense of presence. I carefully walked through the cabin, flashlight in hand, checking every corner, every closet, every window. That's when I noticed them. Small, damp handprints on the interior of the kitchen window, perfectly spaced and too deliberate to be a coincidence, yet the doors were locked, the windows shut. My chest tightened as I realized the prints were not on the outside. They had appeared inside the cabin while I had been alone. Panic overtook me and I grabbed my keys, rushing into the foggy clearing and toward my car. As I started the engine, I caught the faintest glimpse of a dark figure standing at the edge of the trees, perfectly still, watching. I didn't stop to look again, driving blindly down the gravel road, my hands trembling on the wheel, the fog pressing against the headlights like a living thing. Weeks later, I still feel it. Subtle taps on windows when I'm alone, whispers at the edge of hearing that vanish when I strain to locate them, and shadows in my peripheral vision that disappear when I turn to face them. I have never returned to Blackwood Hollow, and I never will. Yet the memory lingers, suffocating and persistent, and I know, without a doubt, that whatever it was that night in the cabin is still out there, patient, silent, waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander into its woods. These 10 stories take us deep into the most isolated corners of the wilderness, where silence can feel heavier than the cold. Shadows linger just beyond your sight, and the feeling of being watched never truly leaves. Each cabin, each forested trail, each fog-drenched clearing reminds us that the world is full of places we shouldn't tread alone, and perhaps for a reason we can't fully understand. While some of these events could be dismissed as imagination, exhaustion, or coincidence, the experiences shared here leave us with a lingering question. What really happens when no one is around to witness it? If any of these tales sent a shiver down your spine or made you glance over your shoulder, you're not alone. Countless others have felt the same chill of the unknown, the creeping sense that something unseen is just outside the perimeter of our reality. If you want to stay connected to more stories like these, true, immersive, and bone-chilling, hit that subscribe button now. Share your own encounters in the comments below. Your story could help someone else feel less alone in the dark. Turn off the lights, keep your senses sharp, and remember, the woods are patient and they always wait for the next visitor.